Imagine raising a child, right?
Okay.
And out of this completely twisted, misguided sense of love, you decide to medically disable their ability to feel physical pain.
Oh, wow. That is a dark thought experiment.
Right. But stick with it. You think you are protecting them. You think you are giving them this life completely free of discomfort.
Yeah, but in reality, you have just guaranteed they're going to, like, leave their hand resting on a hot stove.
Exactly. Until the flesh literally burns to the bone because you haven't liberated them at all. You have just destroyed their biological warning system.
That is brutal, but I mean, it perfectly captures the urgency of the material we are unpacking today.
It really does. Today we are looking at a stack of sources that argue our modern culture has basically done the exact same thing to our minds and our souls.
Just systematically and intentionally destroying the concept of shame.
Yes. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are jumping into this bizarre paradox that we all live in.
Because you wake up every morning in this world that is just, technologically brilliant.
Oh, absolutely. We are engineering AI and mapping genetic codes. We build supercomputers that fit into our genes' pocket.
Right. But simultaneously, we feel completely adrift, morally and spiritually. We have mastered the physical universe. But when it comes to answering the most basic questions about human meaning,
We just pull up a blank screen. We have absolute scientific mastery and utter philosophical confusion.
and that tension right there is the exact focus of our deep dive today.
So we are examining a collection of sources, theological analyses, historical retrospectives, critical reviews, and they are all centered on a highly influential book.
Published back in 1996 by Ravi Zacharias.
Yeah.
It is called Deliver Us from Evil, Restoring the Soul in a Disintegrating Culture.
Now, before we go a single step further, we need to be incredibly clear about the framework here.
Very true. We have to set the table.
The sources we are unpacking approach this text firmly from a conservative Christian worldview.
Yes. And as always, our goal in the deep dive isn't to take a side. We are not endorsing a specific religious or political viewpoint.
Right, we are never here to tell you what to believe. Our job is just to faithfully and impartially unpack the arguments.
To map out the worldviews and the structural logic presented in the material itself, we want to understand how this text diagnoses the culture.
And understanding that specific worldview is totally crucial because this book is not, attempting to be some neutral sociological survey.
Not at all. It operates from a very definitive set of presuppositions. It assumes ultimate reality, the existence of God, and a specific nature of humanity.
It looks at the decay of society and argues the root cause isn't a fluctuation in the global economy.
Or a failure of public policy, right?
Yeah.
Those are merely symptoms in this framework. The actual disease is the loss of the sacred.
And what's fascinating is our specific mission for today. We aren't just looking at the broad philosophical strokes.
Right. We have a very focused question based on these sources.
Exactly. How does this cultural critique from 1996 aim to inspire a Christian listener in 2026 to actually live differently?
How does it challenge believers to love Christ more deeply, to operate in their daily lives with more conviction?
We are going to trace this argument from the macro level of societal collapse all the way down to the micro level of your Tuesday morning commute.
And to do that, we have to start with the book's diagnosis of the culture.
So the sources highlight that the first section of the text identifies three massive cultural forces, the engines of societal decay, basically.
Secularization, pluralization, and privatization. And the author doesn't just define these as dry academic terms.
No, he defines them by what they actively steal from a civilization.
Exactly. So secularization is framed as the loss of shame, pluralization is the loss of reason, or objective truth.
And privatization is the loss of meaning. Okay, wait, I need to pause you right there.
Sure, what's up?
Because we really need to understand the mechanism of these terms. Saying pluralization is the loss of reason sounds incredibly counterintuitive to a modern ear.
Oh, for sure. Today, pluralism is generally viewed as the ultimate virtue.
Right. It is the idea that all worldviews are equally valid and should be celebrated. So how does the book argue that celebrating every worldview actually destroys reason?
It is a brilliant question. And the sources spend a lot of time on this specific mechanism.
Let's hear it.
The argument is that when pluralization dictates that every single worldview is equally valid, it actually assassinates the very concept of objective truth.
Because worldviews fundamentally contradict one another.
Exactly. If worldview A says stealing is objectively wrong, and worldview B says stealing is perfectly fine if it serves my interests.
They cannot both be true in reality.
Right. By validating everything, you actually validate nothing. Reason relies on the law of non-contradiction.
The idea that two opposing truths cannot simultaneously exist in the same context.
Yes, so when a culture abandons that just to avoid offending anyone, reason is replaced by pure subjective preference.
And when reason dies, the only thing left to govern society is power.
That is the grim reality the book points to. Whoever has the loudest voice, the most money, or the most cultural influence gets to dictate reality.
So, in the name of total tolerance, you actually pave the way for ideological tyranny. Because there is no longer a shared standard of truth to appeal to.
That leads right into the analogy the sources highlight regarding the disenchantment of the world.
I love this analogy. The book argues that removing God from public discourse removes a culture's vertical reference point.
It is like building a massive skyscraper,
Right.
but intentionally throwing away the plumb line.
Yes. If you don't have an absolute, unchanging vertical standard hanging from above to measure your construction against, what happens?
The second floor is built referencing the slightly crooked first floor.
And then the third floor references the crooked second floor. By the time you get to the 20th floor, the entire structure is completely warped.
It is ready to collapse. Without a holy God anchoring right and wrong, morality just becomes whatever the cultural consensus decides it is on any given Tuesday.
The skyscraper is leaning, and the people inside are arguing about the wallpaper instead of checking the foundation.
Precisely. And when that vertical plumb line vanishes, the text argues that the very first casualty in the human psyche is a healthy sense of shame.
Which brings us right back to our opening hook, the hot stove.
Right. Shame is to the moral health of a society what pain is to the body.
But here's where I have to push back a little. I want to channel the skepticism of anyone listening to this in 2026.
Lay it on me.
The entire consensus of modern psychology, therapy, and education tells us that shame is fundamentally toxic.
Yeah, it is basically a dirty word now.
We are constantly told that shame destroys self-worth, leads to deep anxiety, and fuels depression.
Which is true in many contexts.
So how does the book reconcile this idea of shame as a necessary divine alarm system with the very real damage that toxic religious guilt has inflicted on people?
It is the essential pushback. And the sources show that the book makes a very careful, vital distinction here.
Between what and what?
Between constructive conviction and destructive condemnation.
Okay, unpack that for me.
In this conservative Christian framework, toxic shame, the kind that says you are a worthless piece of garbage and beyond repair, is not from God.
It is a distortion.
Exactly. But healthy guilt or conviction is entirely different. Conviction targets the action, not the inherent value of the person.
So it says, you are deeply loved by a holy creator, but the action you just took violates his design and is going to destroy you.
That is it exactly. It is the difference between I am bad and I did something bad.
And the text argues that raising a child or building a society without that specific capacity for healthy guilt is leaving them defenseless.
Completely defenseless against evil. Think about the stove again. The physical pain doesn't exist to punish you.
It exists to preserve you.
Right. When you feel that sharp sting of guilt after lying to a friend or betraying a spouse, that emotional pain isn't God rejecting you.
According to the text, it is the profound mercy of a loving father sounding an alarm, calling you back from the edge of a cliff.
Yes. But by prioritizing unconditional self-esteem above moral character, by telling people they are perfect exactly as they are, the culture has dismantled the guardrails.
We've basically turned off the fire alarm while the living room is engulfed in flames.
It is a terrifying image.
Yeah.
And it logically forces a transition in the book's argument.
Because human beings are inherently wired for worship, right? We are wired to seek out meaning.
We can't turn that off.
So if a society successfully disables its moral alarm system, and if it completely abandons that vertical plumb line of the sacred, a massive vacuum is created.
Something else has to rush in to fill that void.
If you look around our world today, what happens when objective truth is gone? What do people chase?
What happens is what the book calls the vacuum of meaning, which leads directly to the rise of the cult of self and the therapeutic culture.
The sources detail how the text maps this out. When the vertical pursuit of a transcendent God is abandoned, people desperately turn to horizontal pursuits.
Because if you can't find ultimate meaning by looking up, you try to manufacture it by looking around.
You try to squeeze ultimate meaning out of material progress or the accumulation of political power.
Or simply endless sensory pleasure and hedonism.
I really want to unpack this therapeutic culture phrase because that is crucial. How exactly are the sources defining that?
Yeah, we need to be clear. because going to therapy is generally a good thing.
Right. We are not bashing mental health care here.
Not at all. In this context, it is drawing on sociological concepts, like those of Philip Reef, about how a civilization shifts its central question.
Okay, what do you mean by its central question?
Well, in a traditional, morally anchored culture, the primary question a person asks when facing a decision is this true and is it right?
So the standard is external to them.
Exactly. But in a therapeutic culture, the primary question shifts completely inward.
To something like, does this make me feel good?
Right. Does this allow me to express my authentic self? The goal of life is no longer virtue or alignment with a higher truth.
The goal is psychological well-being and personal happiness, defined entirely by the individual.
Which connects so profoundly to the listener's reality today. Think about our daily habits.
Oh man, think about the endless doom scrolling, the obsession with curating the perfect aesthetic life on social media.
The exhausting pressure of personal branding on LinkedIn. We are constantly told to live our truth and create our own meaning.
But it seems like that mandate is just crushing us. We are more anxious and depressed than ever before in history.
And the book argues these horizontal pursuits fail so spectacularly because of what it calls the law of diminishing returns.
How does that apply to sensory gratification and horizontal meaning?
The argument presented in the sources is that pleasure, when divorced from ultimate purpose and moral virtue, does not enliven the human soul.
It deadens it. It creates an addictive cycle.
Think of it like building a tolerance to a substance. You need more and more of the stimulus. More money, more likes, more power, more intense experiences.
Just to achieve the exact same baseline level of satisfaction you started with.
And eventually, the pursuit of pleasure simply terminates in profound despair. You are asking things like wealth or status to provide ultimate soul-level fulfillment.
You're asking them to do a job they were literally never designed to do.
It is a shrineless system collapsing under the massive weight of human expectation.
I want to dig into that idea of what things are designed to do, because there is a striking quote from the text that the sources really emphasize here.
Which one?
It says, "Meaning is not something we invent. It is something we discover when we align our will with the Creator's design."
The contrast between inventing and discovering is profound there.
How do you visualize that contrast? Think about it like a highly complex, incredibly advanced piece of software architecture.
Like the operating system of a global financial network, maybe.
Exactly. When you are given access to that system, you don't just sit down at the terminal and say, I think I'm going to invent a new purpose for this code.
I'm going to decide this software is meant to play a simplistic video game.
Right. You can't invent its meaning. If you want it to function, you have to read the documentation.
You have to discover its purpose by consulting the original programmer's intentions.
And if you try to force it to run counter to its underlying code, not only will it fail to play your game, but you will eventually crash the entire system.
That is a great analogy.
So according to the text, how does modern culture's insistence that we invent our own meaning actually lead to a systemic crash in the human psyche?
It leads to a crash because, quite simply, we are not strong enough to bear the weight of being our own gods.
Man, that is heavy.
The sources explain that invented meaning is incredibly fragile. If you are the sole author of your reality, then your reality is only as stable as your fleeting emotions.
Your shifting desires, your limited physical energy.
It is exhausting to try and sustain a universe where you are the sun. Everything has to orbit around your self-esteem and your personal truth.
And the worldview presented in this book argues that true lasting fulfillment requires the exact opposite of self-exaltation.
It requires self-denial. It requires looking at the programmer's documentation, acknowledging the creator, and voluntarily operating within those boundaries.
It is the exhaustion of the self.
Yeah.
And what is so challenging about this specific critique is how it forces a major pivot.
Yeah, because up to this point, it is very easy for a reader or a listener to just nod along and point the finger outward.
Right. It's easy to look at the news and say, yes, the media is terrible, politicians are corrupt, the culture has lost its mind. Society is the problem.
But the sources note that Zacharias doesn't let anyone off the hook that easily. He takes this macro-level diagnosis of a crumbling civilization and points the laser directly inward.
Yes, this is the crucial hinge of the entire book. It shifts from the external symptoms of the culture to the internal reality of the individual human being.
There's a pivotal phrase here. The heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart.
That encapsulates the core of the conservative evangelical worldview that underpins this entire analysis.
The text insists that human beings are fundamentally fallen. Evil is not merely a sociological construct.
It is not just a byproduct of an unfair economic system or a lack of access to higher education or poor urban planning.
No. Evil is an objective spiritual reality, and it has infected the human condition at the deepest, most foundational level.
The sources highlight that Zacharias frequently relies on a very specific theological contrast here.
Christianity is not a system designed to make bad people good.
It is a rescue mission designed to make dead people alive.
I love that we are pausing here, because this flies directly in the face of almost every modern secular solution to societal problems.
Whenever we see the culture disintegrating, our immediate reflex is to apply external fixes.
We think if we just elect the right politicians or pass the right laws, we can fix it.
Right. If we just restructure the economy and fund the right educational programs, we can eradicate greed, hatred, and evil.
But applying external fixes to a fundamentally flawed human heart is like, well, how would you describe it?
It's like trying to fix a deep fundamental coding error in your computer's operating system by just going out and buying a nicer high-definition monitor.
That's a perfect way to frame it.
Right. The display looks better for a minute, the graphics are sharper, but the root code is still completely corrupted.
The system is still going to crash. It's just going to crash in high definition.
You haven't touched the actual disease. So if the root is spiritual, if the problem is the human heart itself, how does the book explain the inevitable failure of all these utopian systems?
The sources show that the book relies heavily on biblical theology to answer this. It specifically references passages like Jeremiah 17.9.
Which declares the human heart is deceitful above all things.
Right. It also points to the Apostle Paul's letters, like Romans 3 and Ephesians 2, which describe humanity as spiritually dead in their transgressions.
So the logical argument the book makes is that you cannot build a flawless society out of inherently flawed materials.
It is a structural impossibility. If the building blocks of your society are human hearts that are naturally prone to selfishness, pride, and rebellion,
then any purely human attempt at moral reform is eventually going to collapse under the weight of its own hypocrisy.
because the evil just finds a new avenue.
Exactly. You can change the laws, you can radically alter the economic environment, but if the internal nature of the citizen remains unchanged,
The inherent selfishness will just adapt. It will find a new way to express itself within the new system.
that is why the text insists that true moral improvement is impossible without spiritual regeneration. You don't need a new environment.
You need a new nature. The code itself has to be rewritten by the original programmer.
Which introduces a massive philosophical collision. Because if we are inherently flawed, and if our natural instincts constantly lead us toward selfishness.
How does this worldview redefine the concept of freedom?
Right. The dominant narrative in our modern culture is that freedom equals the absolute absence of constraints.
Freedom is radical autonomy, the ability to do whatever I want with whoever I want whenever I want.
As long as I don't visibly harm someone else, right?
And the sources note that the book directly tackles this modern definition in its chapter on the fragility of freedom. It draws a very stark contrast.
The modern view, as we just said, is the right to do as one pleases.
But the biblical historical view presented in the text is profoundly different. Freedom is the power to do as one ought.
The power to do as one ought, that completely inverts the modern paradigm.
It really does.
Explain the mechanism there. How is having the power to do what you should do more freeing than doing whatever you want to do?
Let's go back to the discussion on hedonism and the cult of self. The book argues that freedom without absolute moral boundaries is an illusion,
It isn't liberty, it is chaos.
and it ultimately leads to the most severe forms of bondage. If you define freedom purely as the removal of all restraint to pursue your desires, what happens when those desires are self-destructive?
The freedom to pursue any physical pleasure without moral boundaries frequently leads to the absolute tyranny of addiction.
The freedom to ruthlessly pursue wealth without ethical constraints leads to the bondage of paranoia and isolation.
The text argues that true freedom isn't the absence of boundaries. It is operating joyfully within the specific boundaries provided by the Creator's moral laws.
Okay, I track with that logic, but I have to push back hard here.
Let's hear it.
Because we cannot talk about God's moral boundaries without colliding with the reality of the world we live in.
Right.
If God is maintaining these loving guardrails, if he is the ultimate sovereign creator, look around. The world is burning.
There is unspeakable tragedy, cancer, war, and systemic injustice everywhere.
The immediate question a modern person asks when looking at a disintegrating culture is, where is God?
If he is real and he is good, why is he so agonizingly quiet while we suffer?
The sources note that the book addresses this directly, claiming that God's silence is not an indication of his absence.
How on earth does the text justify that? It is arguably the hardest question in theology, the problem of pain.
And the sources show that Zacharias dedicates a significant portion of the book to this. To explain God's apparent silence, the text uses the analogy of a master gardener.
Oh, I've heard this one. It's powerful.
If you observe a master gardener at work, they're often quietest, and their tools seem the most brutal when they are pruning the vines.
To the vine, the pruning shears feel like a violent attack. It feels like destruction.
But the gardener knows that removing the dead wood is the only way to stimulate deeper roots and greater fruitfulness.
The silence isn't abandonment. It is deeply focused, intentional, intimate work. The sources also mention C.S. Lewis in this context, don't they?
Yes, the book leans on Lewis's famous concept from the problem of pain, where he writes that God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain.
Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
In a culture that has systematically tuned God out through secularization, digital distraction, and horizontal meaning, pain is often the only thing loud enough to shatter our illusions.
Suffering strips away our false sense of self-reliance.
When our human-made political systems fail, when our bank accounts can't cure our diseases,
When our horizontal pursuits leave us totally empty, that painful trial is often the very mechanism that forces a culture or an individual to finally look vertically again.
and when we look vertically, the realization hits that those moral guardrails weren't designed to trap us.
The sources reference passages like John 8 and Romans 6, framing God's commandments not as arbitrary restrictions meant to ruin our fun.
But as protective barriers that preserve life. Just like the steel guardrail on a winding, treacherous mountain road.
That guardrail doesn't restrict your freedom to drive. It prevents you from plunging 1,000 feet off the cliff.
Ensuring that you actually have the freedom to reach your destination safely.
Exactly, but diagnosing the cultural disease, identifying the flawed human heart as the root cause, and understanding the protective nature of God's laws, it still leaves us with a massive problem.
Diagnosis is not a cure. If the code is corrupted, how does it get rewritten?
Which brings us to the theological climax of the book. The sources indicate that the text shifts gears dramatically here.
Moving from a relentless cultural critique to presenting the ultimate gospel solution.
It all centers on what the author calls the reality of the cross. And there is a specific, weighty phrase the sources highlight here.
The cross is where justice and mercy meet.
For a listener who might not be steeped in systematic theology, can you deeply unpack how the book explains the mechanics of substitutionary atonement based on these sources?
It is the absolute core of the Christian framework presented in the text. Here's how the logic flows.
Okay, walk me through it.
If God is perfectly holy and perfectly just, he cannot simply turn a blind eye to evil. He cannot sweep the rebellion, the selfishness, and the cruelty of the human heart under the rug.
Think about a human courtroom. If a judge looks at a guilty, unrepentant murderer and says, I'm a loving person, so I'm just going to let you go free with no consequences.
We wouldn't call that judge loving or good. We would call them deeply corrupt.
Right. Justice demands that a penalty be paid for evil. Evil has a cost that must be settled.
Yes. So justice demands a penalty for the inherent evil of the human heart. But God is not only perfectly just, he is also perfectly loving and merciful.
He desires to be reunited with his creation.
Substitutionary atonement is the staggering claim that at the cross, God takes the righteous penalty for human evil upon himself in the person of Jesus Christ.
The cost is paid, but it is paid by the judge.
At the cross, perfect justice is entirely satisfied because the horrific penalty for evil is poured out and paid in full.
Simultaneously, perfect mercy is extended to the humanity that actually committed the evil.
It is the single point in human history where God's unyielding justice and his unfathomable love intersect perfectly without compromising a single ounce of either.
That is incredibly profound. But it brings up a probing question, and I really want us to spend some serious time here.
Go for it.
The sources quote the text saying, "Only when we understand the depth of evil can we appreciate the magnitude of grace."
Meaning, if you minimize the disease, you inevitably minimize the cure.
Right. If we sit around in 2026 and say, well, humanity isn't really that bad, we are mostly good, we just need slightly better public schools and more awareness campaigns.
Then the brutal, bloody reality of the cross seems like a massive, primitive overreaction.
Exactly. How does the book systematically argue that competing worldviews, whether secular or religious, fail to provide a logically coherent answer to the reality of evil when compared to the cross?
This is where the book's background in apologetics really shines. The sources detail how Zacharias uses competing philosophies as foils to illuminate the unique power of the Christian claim.
Let's look at the secular materialist worldview first.
The text heavily engages with thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre in a purely atheistic, materialist framework.
Where the universe is just a closed system of matter and energy, and human beings are just highly evolved, accidental collections of atoms.
Right. In that framework, there is no objective standard for evil at all.
Because there's no plumb line.
Exactly. Without the plumb line, Sartre's existentialism argues that existence precedes essence, meaning we just exist, and we have to invent our own moral essence.
Nietzsche takes it even further with the idea of the Übermensch, the Superman who creates his own values after the death of God.
But the book dismantles this by pointing out a fatal flaw. If we are just atoms, and morality is just an evolutionary survival mechanism or a societal construct,
Then what we call evil is nothing more than a subjective preference.
you might dislike murder, just like you dislike broccoli, but you cannot condemn it in any ultimate cosmic sense.
You can't say it is objectively wrong because there is no objective lawgiver.
The materialist worldview completely fails because it cannot even legitimize the outrage we intuitively feel when we witness an atrocity. It tells us our outrage is just a chemical illusion.
That is a devastating critique of materialism. What about Eastern philosophical thought? The sources mention that as well, don't they?
Yes, the book contrasts the cross with Eastern paradigms, specifically strains of Hinduism and Buddhism.
How do they handle the problem of evil?
In many of those frameworks, evil and suffering are often viewed as maya, or illusion, or they are viewed strictly through the lens of karma.
A rigid, impersonal law of cause and effect where suffering is the direct result of failures in a past life.
The text argues that this framework also falls short because it often leads to fatalism. If someone is suffering because of karma, intervening to help them might actually be interfering with the cosmic debt they need to pay.
And viewing evil as an illusion certainly doesn't heal the visceral, bleeding reality of the human experience.
So how does the cross answer both the intellect and the human heart in a way those systems don't?
The sources show that the text points to passages like 1 Corinthians 2, arguing that Christianity alone provides both a logically coherent explanation for evil and the actual power to overcome it.
The Christian worldview doesn't sweep evil under the rug as an illusion. It doesn't write it off as a subjective evolutionary quirk.
It looks evil dead in the eye, validates our outrage by saying, yes, this is a horrific violation of the Creator's design.
And then offers a God who steps into the blood and dirt of human history to absorb the blow himself.
It provides a grounded reason for justice and a breathtaking mechanism for grace. It doesn't leave humanity trying to pull itself up by its own moral bootstraps.
Okay, we have covered immense ground today.
We really have. We've dissected heavy philosophy, deep systemic theology, and sweeping cultural critiques from the 1990s.
We've talked about Nietzsche, secularization, and substitutionary atonement.
But we need to land the plane right in the listener's driveway. The entire stated mission of today's deep dive is to understand how this material changes a Tuesday morning in 2026.
If a listener fully embraces this worldview,
That the culture is disintegrating because of a loss of the sacred, that the human heart is the root problem, and that the cross is the only cure.
how do they actually live that out?
This is exactly where the book lands in its final chapter, chapter 9, which the sources describe as the call to restoration.
And it is intensely, uncomfortably practical. It outlines what some cultural commentators have called the Benedict option of the heart.
Unpack that. What is the Benedict option?
It refers historically to Saint Benedict. During the fall of the Roman Empire, he formed monastic communities to withdraw from the corrupt culture in order to preserve Christian virtue and theology.
But the sources note that Zacharias is calling for an internal Benedict option.
Right. He is not saying Christians should literally flee to the mountains and build walled compounds.
He is saying that the healing of a disintegrating culture does not start in the halls of Congress or the Capitol building.
It starts with the individual believer cultivating a deep, fiercely protected, private interior life.
You are called to be the salt and light that Jesus talks about in Matthew 5.
Salt to preserve the culture from decay, and light to illuminate the truth.
But you cannot preserve the culture if your own life is compromised by the exact same decay. Public witness is entirely, 100% fueled by private holiness.
This brings to mind the old Indian proverb quoted in the book that our sources highlight.
I think this might be the single most convicting image we've discussed today.
The proverb says, "Whatever you are overflowing with will spill out when you are bumped."
Think about the physics of that. When you are holding a cup of water and someone bumps your arm, water spills out.
It doesn't magically turn into hot coffee just because it was jostled. What is currently inside the cup is precisely what comes out.
So let's translate that directly to the listener. When you are bumped by reality, by a terrible gridlocked traffic jam, by an incredibly rude coworker, by a sudden, vicious argument with your spouse, or by reading a deeply offensive political post online.
What spills out of you? Is it explosive anger? Is it biting sarcasm? Is it existential despair?
Or is it patience, steady grace, and peace? There is another quote from the text here. We cannot put into living what we do not have in life.
How do the sources suggest we actually get the right things inside our cup? Because we've already established we can't just try harder.
Right, sheer willpower is just another external fix that fails.
The sources emphasize a daily, practical concept called the heart audit, drawing directly on Proverbs 4.23, which commands believers to guard your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life.
The text is crystal clear that Christians cannot simply manufacture the fruits of the Spirit. You can't just generate patience, joy, holiness, self-control by clenching your fist and making a New Year's resolution to be a better person.
That is relying on the flawed code to fix the code. Instead, the practical application is to abide in the vine, which is a direct reference to Jesus' teaching in John 15.
What does abiding look like on a Tuesday?
It looks like intentionally rooting your daily mundane life in Christ. It means prioritizing quiet, unglamorous time in prayer.
It means saturating your mind in the scriptures rather than algorithmic social media feeds.
It means practicing a quiet, constant dependence on the Holy Spirit throughout your workday.
The argument is that if your inner reservoir, your cup, is actively being filled with the truth, the grace, and the presence of Christ,
then when the broken world inevitably bumps you, Christ is what spills out onto the people around you. You live from the inside out rather than the outside in.
And the sources point out one final, crucial application regarding the pressure of the modern world. There is a massive cultural pressure to privatize faith.
The disintegrating culture basically offers believers a compromise. It says, sure, you can believe whatever archaic vertical truths you want.
You can have your cross and your absolute morality. Just keep it in your living room or keep it inside your church building for an hour on Sunday.
But when you step into the public square, when you go to your corporate job, when you teach in the classroom, when you post online, you need to adopt the secular therapeutic mindset.
And the book's ultimate challenge to the listener is to absolutely, unequivocally refuse that compromise.
The text challenges believers to refuse to be a secret disciple.
You are called to live your public, professional, and social life with the exact same integrity and theological conviction as your private life.
If the gospel of Jesus Christ is actually true, if the cross is the actual hinge of human history and the only cure for the human heart,
then it is not just a private therapeutic hobby meant to make you feel peaceful. It is the objective truth about reality.
And in a culture that has lost its mind, lost its reason, and lost its soul, your unwavering public commitment to that truth is the greatest act of love you can offer society.
Let's synthesize this incredible journey we've been on. We started by looking at a society that has lost its soul by intentionally abandoning objective truth and the sacred.
Throwing away the vertical plumb line to avoid the discomfort of shame.
We saw how disabling that moral alarm system creates a vacuum of meaning, leading to exhausting horizontal pursuits of the self that only end in the diminishing returns of despair.
We diagnose the root cause not as failure of politics or education, but as the inherently fallen, fundamentally flawed human heart.
We explored how true freedom isn't the chaotic autonomy to do whatever you want, but the power to do what is right within the Creator's loving guardrails.
We saw how God uses the megaphone of pain to call a deaf world back to reality.
And finally, according to the sources, we saw how the cross of Christ offers the only logically coherent, historically grounded remedy, providing the perfect satisfaction of justice, the breathtaking extension of mercy, and the actual spiritual regeneration required for true restoration.
And for you, the listener, the ultimate practical takeaway is this. In a chaotic, rapidly disintegrating world, your greatest contribution to society isn't merely how you vote in the next election.
It isn't what social causes you champion on your social media feeds. Your greatest contribution is the quiet, unshakable integrity of your personal life.
It is being a point of coherence in the midst of absolute ideological chaos.
It is being a person whose life actually makes sense, whose cup spills over with grace when bumped because you are anchored deeply, daily in transcendent truth.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering question to mull over as you go about your week.
We've talked a lot today about the broader culture, privatizing faith, avoiding objective truth, and silencing the alarm system of shame. But let's bring that diagnostic tool all the way home, past the culture, right into our own living rooms.
If the deepest root of cultural disintegration is the privatization of meaning and the avoidance of discomfort,
In what quiet, unnoticed, perfectly rationalized ways are you secretly privatizing your own convictions, just to avoid the awkward discomfort of standing out in your workplace or your friend group?
it is incredibly easy to look at the broken, glaring X-ray of the culture out there.
It is much, much harder to look at the murky, nuanced diagnostic landscape of our own hearts and ask exactly where we've decided to let the divine alarm system go quiet. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We warmly invite you to track down the source material, read it for yourself, and keep exploring these challenging, life-altering ideas on your own.